Welcome to the forest trailhead. Let's go on a soothing stroll to connect with the many wonders that await us. In the forest, there are sights and sounds beckoning us to pause and relish the moment. There is no time like the now, and I am grateful we're going on this stroll together. Settle into a space and position that feels comfortable with the freedom to move at any time. Take a slow, deep breath in for 4 seconds. Hold it for a count of 3 and very slowly release. Take a slow, deep breath in and fill your belly for 4 seconds. Hold it for another soft count of 3 and slowly exhale. One more time, take a slow, deep breath in for 4 seconds. Hold it for a soft count of 3 and exhale. Continue inhaling and exhaling as you would normally for a few moments. Now, let's say goodnight to the wonder of the forest together. Goodnight, Emerald Labyrinth. Goodnight, Moss Kiss Stone. Goodnight, Whispering Wind. Goodnight, Dew-Kissed Leaf. Goodnight, Rustling Undergrowth. Goodnight, Sunlight Splinter. Goodnight, Ancient Gnarled Root. Goodnight, Hidden Brook. Goodnight, Soaring Hawk Cry. Goodnight, Owl's Silent Gaze. Goodnight, Firefly Ballet. Goodnight, Woodland Perfume. Goodnight, Timberwolf Howl. Goodnight, Forest Floor Tapestry. Goodnight, Dewdrop Symphony. Goodnight, Sun-Warmed Log. Goodnight, Wildflower Meadow. Goodnight, Whispering Fern Frond. Goodnight, acorn's gentle roll. Goodnight, stream's smooth pebble. Goodnight, moonlit clearing. Goodnight, spider's silver web. Goodnight, ancient whispered lore. Goodnight, earth's soft embrace. Goodnight, forgotten forest path. Goodnight, sun-drenched canopy. Goodnight, rustling secrets. Goodnight, woodland hush. Goodnight, dancing butterfly wings. Goodnight, raindrop serenade. Goodnight, sun-dappled path. Goodnight, mossy whisper. Goodnight, emerald embrace. Goodnight, leaping deer. Goodnight, hidden brook gurgling. Goodnight, sunlight through leaves. Goodnight, bird's melodic call. Goodnight, ancient whispering bark. Goodnight, wind's playful tug. Goodnight, spider's silken thread. Goodnight, acorn's hidden treasure. Goodnight, sunlight's dappled dance. Goodnight, owl's silent wisdom. Goodnight, wolf's haunting echo. Goodnight, moonlit secrets. Goodnight, fern frond unfurls. Goodnight, squirrels' playful chatter. Goodnight, streams' gurgling symphony. Goodnight, Earth's mossy lullaby. Goodnight, forgotten paths beckon. Goodnight, sunlight kisses leaves. Goodnight, raindrops crystal chime. Goodnight, birds' soaring journey. Goodnight, ancient bark's weathered story. Goodnight, wind's whispered secrets. Goodnight, spider's intricate web. Goodnight, acorn's promise of life. Goodnight, sunlight's dappled embrace. Goodnight, owl's silent flight. Goodnight, wolf's mournful song. Goodnight, moonlit sanctuary. Goodnight, fern frond's gentle touch. Goodnight, squirrel's acrobatic feats. Goodnight, streams' babbling laughter. Goodnight, Earth's nurturing hand. Goodnight, forgotten paths' winding way. Goodnight, sunlit leaves. Goodnight, raindrops' glistening tear. Goodnight, birds' song paints the sky. Goodnight, ancient bark's weathered wisdom. Goodnight, wind's playful caress. Goodnight, spider's silken masterpiece. Goodnight, acorn's hidden potential. Goodnight, sunlight's dappled haven. Goodnight, owl's silent flight. Goodnight, wolf's watchful spirit. Goodnight, moonlit lullaby. Goodnight, fern frond's verdant cloak. Goodnight, squirrel's mischievous dash. Goodnight, stream's crystal melody. Goodnight, earth's gentle heartbeat. Goodnight, forgotten paths, whispered tales. Goodnight, sunlight warms the leaves. Goodnight, raindrops, sparkling diamond. Goodnight, birds, whispered lullaby. Goodnight, ancient bark's weathered tapestry. Goodnight, wind's playful song. Goodnight, spider's woven dreams. Goodnight, acorn's promise of hope. Goodnight, sunlight's dappled sanctuary. Goodnight, owl's silent wisdom. Goodnight, wolf's watchful echo. Goodnight, moonlit whispers. Goodnight, fern frond's secret dance. Good night, squirrels, whispered chatter. Good night, streams, gurgling laughter. Good night, Earth's silent embrace. Good night, forgotten paths, hidden secrets. Goodnight, my friend.